So this might sound really weird, but one of my favorite things about fantasy football is watching how every week has a different phase for different fantasy managers. Like before week 1, everybody drafts their team. They're all super excited and hyped about their team. They think it's their year. After week 1, before week 2, people overreact. And they overreact a lot about things that in the long run don't really even matter. After week 2 and before week 3, people start to panic. You're down 0-2. You've got a couple players just not performing for you who are high draft picks. You start to panic, man. And there are plenty of guys that you may be panicking on right now. So today we're going through the list of players that people are most panicking on that I have seen in my comment section. And I'm going to gauge the panic level that we should be attributing to each player from not concerned, mildly concerned, and panic mode. I will be back in my regular studio soon, guys. I appreciate y'all sticking with me throughout this time in the studio downgrade. Please make sure to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already to show support for the channel. It's greatly appreciated. So let's go ahead and just dive into the first guy right here. I mean, this guy to me, this one hurts, I'll be honest with you, because this was one of my most drafted players in all of 2023 fantasy football. I was screaming about him this offseason. I love the guy. I think he could still rebound, but I have some mild concern for Justin Fields. Mild concern because here's the reality. This one is honestly multi-layered. It has a lot of different layers to this one. So when you're looking at Justin Fields, just from a football watching perspective, if you have watched Justin Fields over the past 2 weeks, he looks a lot like how he did at the beginning of last year. He looks a little bit better than he did at the beginning of last year, but he looks very uncomfortable in the pocket. I mean, he's not breaking off as many big runs. He's clearly trying to become more of a cerebral pocket passer, and I just don't think that's who he is. I don't think that's who he is, and I don't think that's who he should try to be. But the good thing is, obviously, we know how that turned out later in the year. Obviously, later in the year, by mid-season, he was breaking off 40-point fantasy games. He was tremendous in fantasy football in the back half of last year. But my problem with him this year, and the reason that I really do have some mild concern here, is that think back to last year. He didn't have DJ Moore. He didn't even have a true number 1 wide receiver. Darnell Mooney was down after that. I mean, Darnell Mooney missed a good portion of last season with an ankle injury. So he didn't have a wide receiver 1 that he was dealing with. This time he does. He has DJ Moore. This team added DJ Moore during the offseason. So the fact that he's struggling this much in the pocket is a big concern with me. I mean, he's got a 2 to 3 touchdown interception ratio right now and a 60% completion percentage right now. Those are just not good numbers. And they lost last week to a team that was led by Baker Mayfield, and Baker Mayfield looked like the best quarterback on the field. That is a serious problem. Now, the good thing here, and the reason it's only a mild concern level, is because Justin Fields has that sweet, sweet rushing upside at the quarterback position that is so invaluable. And so, even when you're seeing bad weeks like this through the air from Justin Fields, the floor is not that low because he can still run the ball. He got a rushing touchdown in week 2. This guy can still score you plenty of fantasy points because he has a safe floor with that rushing upside. So honestly, the way I look at this is yes, I drafted him in a bunch of leagues. I do have concerns about if he's going to really recover or if he's just turning out to not be a great quarterback. But what I would do if I didn't have him is I would try to lowball someone. I would try to send a lowball offer, someone in the range of Daniel Jones maybe, or maybe even someone like Jordan Love, I think. And I think you could probably get more in addition to Justin Fields if you send a guy like Jordan Love who's lighting it on fire right now. I have concerns, but I really do like the opportunity of trading low right now for Justin Fields. Moving on to our next guy, I've got no interest in trading for him. I'm trying to sell this guy, and it sucks to say because this was another guy that I was really big on this offseason. I'm in full panic mode with Alexander Madison. Full out panic mode with Alexander Madison. This one sucks, man. Like I said, I told you guys to draft him all offseason, and I apologize because this was a really, really bad call. And I will be doing my what I got right and wrong in week 2 fantasy football video on Tuesday night, and I'll give you a little sneak peek. Alexander Madison's on the list of things I got wrong. I mean, I'm ready to take my L season long on Alexander Madison at this point. I was dead wrong. I mean, this guy is not efficient at all. 3.3 yards per carry, and he's not getting enough volume either. 19 carries through 2 weeks. Here's the reality of what he's dealing with in Minnesota. This Minnesota Vikings team, they're a pass-first offense right now. They're always passing the ball. Kirk Cousins threw like 44 passes in week 1, and I think he threw close to that in week 2. This team is not a run-first team, and the reason why is because they know that they have a clear running back downgrade with Alexander Madison. The only saving grace here that Alexander Madison has, and honestly I think what really leads to him having some trade value, is that he has 5 targets a game. He's got 10 total targets through week 2, and he also is the running back 1 on this offense. So there are 2 selling points that you could do. Now, you're not going to go out there and trade him for a guy like Travis Etienne or Tony Pollard. Like, that's not in the cards here at all for Alexander Madison. What I would do personally, and I've thought about this one for the past 48 to 72 hours, to be honest with you, and I've come up with, I think, a really good plan. What I would do personally is I would go out and look for a guy like Tyler Algier to trade for in exchange for Alexander Madison. And the reason I say that is because you can sell the idea that Alexander Madison is the running back 1. He handles the majority of the workload in the running back room, and he's also a pass catcher, and Tyler Algier has none of those things. I prefer Tyler Algier because I know that this offensive line in Atlanta is great. I know that Tyler Algier will continue to get carries, and I also know that you could probably upgrade at wide receiver. If you include a lower tier wide receiver, you could probably upgrade a tier above. Say you got a guy like Garrett Wilson on a team you also want to sell. Sell Garrett Wilson. You could probably upgrade to a guy like T. Higgins or Jalen Waddle, or maybe even Calvin Ridley off a bad week. This is a situation where I don't think it's hopeless, just from a trade value perspective, but if you plan on holding him, buckle up, because I don't think this one is going to get much better anytime soon. A.J. Brown is our next guy right here, and this one is honestly just such an easy one for me. I've got absolutely 0% concern about A.J. Brown, and here's why. So first, let's acknowledge obviously the issues here. Yes, A.J. Brown has had a bad 2 weeks in fantasy football. And yes, Devonta Smith does look like this wide receiver 1 in Philadelphia this year. Comes to a surprise to all of us, man. But let's look a little bit closer about A.J. Brown and what he's done the last 2 weeks in fantasy football. So A.J. Brown played the New England Patriots in week 1. And I said all leading up to that week, on every single video, I thought it was going to be a tough matchup for A.J. Brown specifically, because Bill Belichick is known for taking away your number 1 option, regardless of who it is. Running back, wide receiver, tight end, they're taking away your number 1 guy. Well, that's exactly what happened. But even then, A.J. Brown had an okay game, and he had 10 targets in that game in week 1. He wasn't exactly bad. The week 2 week was unfortunate because I had him ranked as a top 3 wide receiver last week, and he was a massive disappointment. I mean, he was going up against a Minnesota defense that is not good defending the pass, and it didn't work. And the reason I say it's unfortunate here is because if you watched that game, that A.J. Brown had a touchdown in that game, but it was called back due to an offensive penalty. If he scores that touchdown, people are not worried about A.J. Brown right now. They're not. They would just say week 1 was week 2, he rebounded. That would be A.J. Brown's perspective in the fantasy football community if that touchdown counted. So in addition to that, also let's look at this. He's got 16 targets through 2 weeks as well. So to my point, he's not being ignored in this offense. It's not like they're literally just like, A.J. Brown, you're not good anymore. We're just going to hyper-target Devonta Smith. That's not the case here. This is a situation that's similar to the Cincinnati Bengals with T. Higgins and Jamar Chase. They're both still getting plenty of volume in Philadelphia as well. This team, honestly, they have not gotten it going offensively. I've watched the Eagles both weeks now, and their team doesn't look the same offensively. And I think that a large part of that is because they're struggling to adjust without Shane Steichen. With that said, the reason I have no concern here for A.J. Brown is because we know what A.J. Brown can do, and I believe that Jalen Hurts is good enough to not need Shane Steichen long term. I think Shane Steichen helped develop the confidence in Jalen Hurts, and I think that Jalen Hurts just needs to get it going, and it's going to happen. And I do think that any week now, A.J. Brown is going to go off, and he was included in my buy low trade target video before week 3. I love getting A.J. Brown right now. Capitalize on people panicking because you should not be panicking on A.J. Brown. Our next guy here, I am in complete full panic mode again. Naji Harris of the Pittsburgh Steelers. I want nothing to do with Naji Harris right now. And honestly, this one is also multi-layered, similar to Justin Fields. For those of you who don't know, I am a Pittsburgh Steelers fan. I have family in Pittsburgh. I grew up as a Steelers fan. It's in my family bloodline, okay? But what I always say on this channel is that my fantasy football analysis will always come first before being a Pittsburgh Steelers fan. I think sometimes fantasy analysts, if you're a fan of a team, you can get kind of jaded just by your team rather than just being committed to being a fantasy football analyst. I'm committed to my fantasy analysis before being a Pittsburgh Steelers fan. But what I will also say about that is that since I have watched the Steelers literally since I can remember, I know what this team does and I know their tendencies here. I know exactly what Mike Tomlin does here. The Pittsburgh Steelers are a very loyal franchise, which means that if they have guys that they like, they will put up with lots of bad play. I mean, look at Big Ben the last couple years. Big Ben was not a good player anymore. Antonio Brown was never a bad player, but they put up with a lot of character and personal issues during his time in Pittsburgh. Naji Harris was anointed a leader in this locker room by Mike Tomlin immediately after his rookie season. Like, there were reports back then after 2021 that Mike Tomlin, he was a favorite of Mike Tomlin's after that. And he was also a first-round pick. So the way I look at it is I don't worry about Naji Harris being benched. That's not what I'm worried about. The reason you panic on this one is because he's just not good. That's the reality here. Not only is he not good, the offensive line is not good. And the offense as a whole is absolutely atrocious, and the play calling is even worse. This offense is absolutely atrocious right now. And while I'm not worried about Naji Harris specifically being outright benched, like I said, I do acknowledge that Jaylen Warren is a better player than Naji Harris is. So Jaylen Warren is going to continue to get work out of this backfield. This is just a bad situation all around. It's such a bad situation. I would try to trade a guy like him for a guy like Breece Hall or James Cook because while the volume may be very similar with those guys, they're way more efficient and they have so much more upside than Naji Harris does. Now moving on to the elephant in the room, I think, and the one that a lot of people are here for is Jamar Chase of the Cincinnati Bengals. I have mild concern about this, and there's only one reason to, and I'll get to it in a minute. He was almost a not concerned at all guy, and let's go through it. So it's honestly funny on this one to me, first off, is that Jamar Chase, I really didn't think was going to be a guy that people were going to be trying to get off their roster so desperately after this week. I was wrong. I have gotten tons of questions in my comment section asking me if they should be selling Jamar Chase for someone like Puka Nacua, who, by the way, I'm not saying Puka Nacua is not a good fantasy option right now. He clearly is. But there are some things that we need to discuss here and be reminded of when it comes to Jamar Chase. So with Jamar Chase, he's the wide receiver 63 through 2 weeks. Obviously, awful number. Averages 6.1 fantasy points per game through the first 3 weeks, through the first 2 weeks as well. So this is not obviously he's not been good. That's why he's on this list right now. Cincinnati is off to a slow start once again. And the reason I say once again is because we need to remember the history of the Bengals, specifically with Joe Burrow. Joe Burrow's Bengals have started slow now the past 3 seasons. In 2021, they started slow because Joe Burrow was recovering from his ACL tear that he suffered in his rookie season. In 2022, Joe Burrow had appendicitis leading up to the season, missed a lot of time. They started slow once again. And now this year, Joe Burrow's got the calf strain. It's probably an issue again. That's why they're starting out slow. But the reality is, every single year, they have bounced back and they have performed for you in fantasy football when it matters most in playoff time. That's the important thing to remember here with Jamar Chase. And so, like I said, I mentioned that Jamar Chase he's the wide receiver 62 right now in fantasy football through 2 weeks. Let's look at the list of guys who are in wide receiver 60 to 70 range right here. So as you can see on the screen, there's one guy that stands out, and it's clearly Jamar Chase. And the reason he stands out is not just because of his big name, but also because look at the other guys. Some of the higher end guys have 10, 11, 12 targets through the first 2 weeks. Jamar Chase has 17 targets through 2 weeks. Again, very similar to AJ Brown. It's not like he's literally just being flat out ignored. He's not being ignored. And you also drafted him in the first round of fantasy football drafts. Everybody who plays fantasy football, nobody got him in the second round unless it was a 4-person league. Jamar Chase was a top tier pick in fantasy football drafts this year? The simple answer is you cannot bail out this early on your first round pick, especially when you have to look at those other numbers right there. Because the only reason that I'm only mildly concerned with Jamar Chase is because, like I mentioned, Joe Burrow did have a re-aggravation of that calf injury. So I've already seen reports that he may not play this week. It could be a problem here for sure, and that's the only reason I'm concerned right now. And I get it, right now sucks with Jamar Chase. You may very well be 0-2. Like, that's the reality here. But just remember this, Jamar Chase plays his best when it matters the most. And you want a guy like that when you are contending at the back half of the season. I know first 2 weeks, you get off to a slow start, it sucks, and you feel like your season's over. It's only been 2 weeks, guys. Let's take a deep breath. Everything's going to be okay. Just make sure that we're continuing to prepare every single week. So let me know who you're concerned about after week 2 fantasy football and before week 3 fantasy football. And if you want to see the top 30 wide receiver rankings for week 3 fantasy football, click on this video right here.